Chapter number 13, Part 2 of the Life of Captain James Cook, the Circumnavigator, by Arthur Kitson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter number 13, 1772 to 1774, the Second Voyage, Part 2. New Zealand once more. On the 7th of October, sailing for New Zealand, they were delayed by contrary winds, and did not sight the neighbourhood of Table Cape till the 21st. They stood in to Tolago and Poverty Bays, with the intention of presenting any chiefs who came off, with pigs, fowls, and garden seeds, in hopes of making a commencement in stocking the island, but none were seen till Cape Kidnappers was reached, when two made their appearance, and were duly given 2 boars and 2 sows, and 4 hens and 2 cocks, first obtaining a promise that they should not be killed. To these were added a supply of seeds, such as peas, beans, cabbage, turnips, etc. Standing on through a series of heavy squalls, in one of which the Resolution lost her fore-top-gallant mast, they ran into a violent gale, which lasted for a week, and after a slight moderation came on with increased fury, and the 2 vessels parted company. On the 3rd of November the Resolution reached her old anchorage in Ship Cove, Queen Charlotte's Sound, but the Adventure was seen no more during the voyage. Forster was much upset by the stormy weather, the dreadful energy of the language of the sailors, the absence of their consort, which doubled every danger, the shortness of the table supplies, and his own dislike to a further trip to southern latitudes. Hoping the Adventure might yet come in, Cook pushed on with his refit and thoroughly overhauled his stores. About 4,000 pounds weight of ship's bread was found unfit for food, and another 3,000 pounds nearly as bad. They were very fortunate, therefore, in getting a plentiful supply of scurvy grass and wild celery, and a small quantity of vegetables from the gardens they had previously laid out. Any doubts that may have been felt about the cannibalism of the New Zealanders was set at rest by some of the officers who surprised a party engaged in a feast. A human head was purchased from the feasters and taken on board, and a piece of the flesh being offered to a Maori was greedily devoured. A South Sea Islander, Oditi, was intensely horrified and refused to touch the knife with which it had been cut, nor would he be in any way friendly with the eater. Cook firmly believed that only enemies killed in battle were eaten, and did not think the custom arose from any shortness of food. Enclosing in a bottle, which was buried under a marked tree in the garden, a memorandum giving the dates of his arrival and departure, the direction he intended to steer, and other information he thought might be useful to Furneaux, Cook sailed on the 25th of November, and as they passed through the straits, guns were continually fired, and a sharp lookout kept for signs of the Adventure, but nothing was seen, and as no other rendezvous had been appointed, Cook gave up all hope of her rejoining him. The Resolution, when clear, bore up for the south-east, but had the course at the first been north of east, the 2 ships might possibly have met, for the Adventure was then on her way from Tolago Bay, and arrived in Ship Cove 4 days after the departure of her consort. Cook says his crew were in good spirits, and in no way dejected, or thought the dangers we had yet to go through were in the least increased by being alone. They were quite ready to go, wherever I might think proper to lead them. Even Mr. Forster had to admit at a little later date that, notwithstanding the constant perils to which our course exposed us in this unexplored ocean, our ship's company were far from being so uneasy as might have been expected. Armour of ice. On the 6th of December at 8:30 a.m. they reckoned they were at the antipodes to our friends in London, consequently as far removed from them as possible. Here a swell coming from the south-west showed there was no great body of land in that direction, except at a considerable distance. The first ice was seen on the 12th of December in 62 degrees 10 minutes south, and on the 15th in 66 degrees south. They were obliged to edge away north, as they were surrounded by large quantities of loose ice, and it was very foggy. Working up to between 64 and 65 degrees, they again headed east, still hampered by ice and fog, but in a few days the weather improved a little, and they recovered the Antarctic Circle, and reached 67 degrees 31 minutes south on the 23rd, the highest south latitude hitherto attained. The rigging was so coated with ice that it was difficult to work the ship, and Cook altered his course to the north-east. Mara says, under the 18th of December, icicles frequently hung to the noses of the men, more than an inch long. The men, cased in frozen snow, as if clad in armour, where the running rigging was being so enlarged by frozen sleet as hardly to be grasped by the largest hand. Yet under all these hardships the men cheerful over their grog, and not a man sick, but of old scars. Cook says that some of the men suffered from fever brought on by the unavoidable exposure to cold and wet, but it was slight, and happily yielded to the simplest remedies. The ship was so surrounded by masses of ice as to cause some apprehension, but by taking advantage of every breath of air, the danger was averted. Christmas Day was passed in constant watchfulness. We were fortunate in having continual daylight and clear weather, for had it been foggy as in some of the preceding days, nothing less than a miracle could have saved us from being dashed to pieces. On the 7th of January 1774, 5 very successful observations gave the mean longitude as 123 degrees 21 minutes west. The watch gave it 123 degrees 44 minutes, and the dead reckoning as 123 degrees 39 minutes. Cook signifies his keen apprehension of the watch machine, and says, "I must here take notice that our longitude can never be erroneous while we have so good a guide as Mr. Kendall's watch." Obedient and alert. A further attempt to the south was made, and on the 30th of January the high latitude of 71 degrees 10 minutes south was reached, in longitude 106 degrees 54 minutes west, further progress being stopped by a large and solid field of ice. This record was not beaten till 1823 by Weddell, and until recent years very few of the attempts on Antarctic discovery had proved as successful. Satisfied that there was no continent existing within the Arctic Circle, except so far south as to be practically inaccessible on account of ice, he acknowledged he did not regret he found it impossible to go further, and thinking that in the unexplored parts of the South Pacific there was room for many large islands, and also that discoveries already made had been imperfectly laid down on the charts, he decided that it was his duty, as he had a well-found ship and a healthy crew, to remain in these waters and add what he could to the knowledge of geography. He therefore planned to find the land discovered by Juan Fernandez in 38 degrees south, and if unsuccessful, to proceed to Easter Island and fix its position, as it was very uncertain, then to proceed to Otaheite, where he had a faint hope he might hear from the Adventure, and proceeded further west, settled the position of Tierra Austral de Espiritu Santo of de Quiros, afterwards to turn southeast, and reaching Cape Horn in November, he would have the best part of the summer for exploration in the South Atlantic. He says, "Great as this design appears to be, I, however, thought it possible to be executed, and when I came to communicate it to the officers, I had the satisfaction to find they all heartily concurred in it. I should not do these gentlemen justice if I did not take some opportunity to declare that they always showed the utmost readiness to carry into execution, in the most effectual manner, every measure I thought proper to take. Under such circumstances, it is hardly necessary to say that the seamen were always obedient and alert, and on this occasion they were so far from wishing the voyage at an end that they rejoiced at the prospect of its being prolonged another year, and of soon enjoying the benefits of a milder climate." Mr. Forster does not agree with this account, for he says, "The long continuance of these cold climates began now to hang heavily on our crew, especially as it banished all hope of returning home this year, which had hitherto supported their spirits. At first a painful despondence owing to the dreary prospect of another year's cruise to the south seemed painted on every countenance, till by degrees they resigned themselves to their fate with a kind of sullen indifference. It must be owned, however, that nothing could be more dejecting than the entire ignorance of our future destination, which, without any apparent reason, was constantly kept a secret to every person in the ship. It is evident that Cook and his officers did not think it necessary to consult Mr. Forster as to the movements of the ship, or what is more probable, he was in one of his irritable moods, and must say something nasty about someone. The decision to turn northwards was taken none too soon, for on the 6th of February a furious storm came on, playing havoc with the sails and running rigging, and though it abated somewhat next morning, it blew very strong till the 12th, and would have been highly dangerous if it had caught them amongst the ice. On the 17th, Cook judged he had crossed his outward track of 1769, and on the 20th he notes the thermometer rising to 66 degrees, the only real summer day they had experienced since leaving New Zealand. Having arrived at the position laid down for the land supposed to have been seen by Juan Fernandez, he cruised about, but found no signs, so on the 25th stood away for Easter Island. Cook was now taken seriously ill, and was confined to his bed for several days by what he calls the bilious colic, during which time Mr. Patton, the surgeon, was to me not only a skilful physician but an affectionate nurse. He recovered very slowly, and the want of fresh food told against him when it came to the question of gathering strength. The only fresh meat on board was a dog belonging to Mr. Forster, which was duly sacrificed and made into soup. Thus I received nourishment and strength from food which would have made most people in Europe sick. Mara's journal says, under the 23rd of February, "This day the captain was taken ill, to the grief of all the ship's company." 28th February, "The captain this day much better, which each might read in the countenance of the other, from the highest officer to the meanest boy on board the ship." 4th March, "The captain perfectly recovered from his illness, to the great joy of the ship's company." Easter Island. At 8 a.m. on the 11th of March, Easter Island was sighted from the masthead, and shortly after noon Some of the gigantic statues mentioned in Roggewin's Voyages were clearly distinguished through the glasses. The position of the ship at noon had been fixed as 27 degrees 3 minutes south, 109 degrees 46 minutes west. Standing on and off till next morning, fair anchorage was found in 36 fathoms, but it proved too near the edge of a bank, and they were driven off it in the night. One of two canoes came out to meet them as they were working back, from which plantains were purchased, and Cook proceeded ashore, where he was immediately surrounded by natives. Indeed, some even swam out to meet him. Many of them possessed European hats, jackets, handkerchiefs, etc., which they were said to have obtained from the Spaniards in 1770. Their language was very similar to that of Otaheite, and Odete was able to understand them fairly well. There were no trees exceeding 10 feet in height, and the land was described as extremely parched and dreary, though a few plantations were seen. Some remarkable pieces of stonework were noticed, enclosing small areas of ground, in some of which were the statues already mentioned. These were not looked upon by the natives as objects of worship, although they did not like the pavements by which they were surrounded being walked over, or the statues being closely examined. Mr. Forster regarded the enclosures as burial grounds, and the statues, portions of some of them are at the British Museum, as monuments to chiefs. The water supply being found very bad, though Gonzales is said to have found good springs, and the fresh food for sale but scanty, the stay was cut short, and on the 16th of March sail was made for the Marquesas, discovered by Mendana in 1595. The next day, according to Mara, the fresh provisions obtained were served out to the crew at the captain's expense, namely 2 pounds of potatoes a man and a bunch of bananas to each mess, and this without reducing their ordinary allowance. An act of generosity which produced its effect. It preserved the crew in health and encouraged them to undergo cheerfully the hardships that must unavoidably happen in the course of so long a voyage. Market spoilt. The Marquesas were reached on the 7th of April, and after a narrow escape from running on the rocks, satisfactory anchorage was obtained, and they were visited by some of the natives, from whom breadfruit and fish were purchased. The next day further trading was done, nails being the chief medium of exchange, but the natives were inclined to be smart in their dealings, and on several occasions obtained payment without delivery. Cook here suffered from a relapse, but was able to get about, and after warning the officer on watch to keep a smart lookout, or something of importance would be stolen, he took his seat in a boat to go in search of a better anchorage. He was then informed that a stanchion had been stolen from the gangway, and the thief had got away to his canoe on the other side of the ship. He ordered a shot to be fired over the canoes, but no one was to be hurt, and he would pull around and secure the thief. The order was apparently misunderstood, for the thief was killed, and the rest of the natives hurried ashore. Soon after, trading recommenced, and the lesson appeared forgotten, for an attempt was made to steal the kedge anchor, by which the ship was being warped nearer the shore. Cook landed, and the trading went on as if nothing out of the common had occurred, and some pigs, so small that it required 40 or 50 to provide one meal for the crew, and fruit were purchased, but in the afternoon, when the boats went in for water, all the natives had disappeared. This Cook attributed to not being with them, for the next morning when he landed, trading was resumed. A short trip was made in the boats along the coast, and when they returned it was found the market was closed. It seemed one of the young gentlemen had given a small handful of red feathers he had obtained at Tonga for a small pig, and now nothing else would be accepted, so they sailed for Otaheite on the 11th. Cook was very much annoyed at the ill success in obtaining fresh provisions, for though none of the crew were ill, he thought they stood in need of a change of food. He describes the inhabitants as the finest race he had seen in the South Seas, almost as fair as Europeans, and their language very similar to that of Otaheite. Their arms consisted of clubs, spears, and slings, the two former very neatly made. With the latter they threw stones a considerable distance, but without accuracy. Mr. Forster managed to secure a quantity of small birds with very beautiful plumage. On the 17th of April they sighted the George Islands, discovered by Byron, native name Tiukia, but after sending the master to report on the lagoon, Cook decided it was too dangerous to enter, and Mr. Cooper went off with 2 boats to see if it were possible to trade. He obtained a few dogs and coconuts, but the attitude of the natives was so uncertain he would not land, and returned to the ship. One of the sailors exchanged a plantain for a dog, so it was concluded the fruit was unknown. On the 19th 4 more islands were discovered, and named Palliser Islands, and on rounding one, a strong swell rolling in from the south was encountered, a sure sign that we were clear of these low islands. On the 21st, land a little to the east of Point Venus was sighted, and next morning they anchored at Matavai Bay, being immediately visited by the natives, who seemed greatly pleased to see them again. The old camp was reoccupied, the observatory set up for Mr. Wales, and Cook had again the pleasure to record he had no one on the sick list. The king, Otu, came to visit the camp, bringing as his present a dozen pigs and some fruit, and then with some of his friends went on board ship to dinner and to receive the return present. It was then found that the red feathers were greatly valued, a very fortunate thing, as articles of trade were running short. Cook, after the disappointment in securing supplies at the last visit, intended to make a very short stay, but the place now appeared to be very thriving. Houses and canoes were being built in all directions, and there was every sign of prosperity, so he decided to remain and refit. On the 25th of April they had a thunderstorm lasting 3 hours, such as no one on board had experienced before. The Otaheitan Fleet. Going to visit Otu on the next day, Cook was surprised to see a large number of fully manned canoes ranged along the coast, and a large body of armed men on the land near them. On landing he was surrounded by people and seized by 2 chiefs, one of whom wanted to carry him off to see the king and the other to see the fleet, and between the two I was like to be pulled to pieces, the crowd making way with cries of "Tia non tuti." He was gradually drawn towards the fleet, but refused to go on board, and after a time was allowed to return to his own boats, when he found his companions had been subject to similar treatment. They put out from shore in order to have a good look at the fleet, and counted 160 large double canoes, all well equipped and fully manned. The chiefs were swathed in vast quantities of cloth, so that to the Englishmen it seemed almost a miracle they were able to move. The vessels were decorated with flags and streamers, and made a very fine appearance. These were the first line, and in addition there were 170 smaller double canoes, each having a small house or castle on it, which were thought to be transports and store ships, as the larger ones, as far as could be seen, carried no supplies on board. The number of men on board was estimated to be no less than 7,500, and it was ascertained this armada was intended for the subjugation of Eimeo, which had lately rebelled against Otaheite. Cook was informed Otoo was waiting at the camp for him, but on going there he found he had not been there, and on looking for him again in the afternoon he was still invisible. The fleet had also gone away, and then it was discovered that some of Cook's clothes had been stolen from the wash, and the King and Admiral were both in dread of his anger. However, Cook sent word he should not take any steps to recover the stolen articles, and things resumed a friendly aspect. The Admiral, Towha, sending Cook a present of 2 large pigs and some fruit, giving orders to the bearers that they were to receive nothing in exchange. He soon after paid a visit to the ship, and as it was his first, he examined everything with great curiosity, and appeared greatly impressed with what he saw. One of the natives, having been caught making off with a small water cask, Cook determined he should be punished, and made a ceremonial affair of it. The culprit was first sent on board and put in irons. The natives and the crew mustered, and then the thief was taken on shore and triced up. Cook then made a short speech, in which he pointed out that when his men were caught stealing from the natives, they were always punished, but the natives were always stealing from the ship and crew and getting away unpunished. He therefore ordered the man to be given 24 lashes. These were duly administered, and Towha made a speech, in which he was understood to admit the justice of Cook's action. The marines were then put through their drill, and fired a few volleys with ball, and the proceedings terminated. But Cook declares he did not know whether the natives were pleased or frightened by the ceremony. The King's brother then took some of the officers out to see part of their fleet at exercise, and they were just in time to see the conclusion and the landing of the men. Cook says the canoes were handled very smartly, and 5 minutes after putting ashore you could not tell anything of the kind had been going forward. The sea stores were again overhauled, and although the greatest care had been taken with the packing, large quantities of bread were found to be unedible, rendering the purchase of fresh food at every opportunity of the greatest importance. A state visit was paid on board by Otoo's father and some other members of the royal family, who presented Cook with a complete mourning dress, a curiosity we most valued. In return I gave him whatever he desired, which was not a little, and having distributed red feathers to all the others, conducted them ashore in my boat. Musket stolen. On the 7th of May, the King expressed a wish to see Cook, so the latter went ashore, but found His Majesty and many of his leading men had disappeared, and the Sergeant of Marines reported that one of his men had had his musket stolen whilst on duty. Cook gave orders that if the musket was returned, nothing further was to be said, and returned to his ship. Suspicion was attracted to 6 canoes laden with fruit and baggage, so Cook gave chase in his own boat. One of the canoes then made for the ship, and the occupants, women whom he recognised, informed him they were taking some things to the Resolution, and that the King was at Point Venus. Cook went to the camp to find this was only a story to put him off, and he once again gave chase, ordering another boat to follow. A few shots were fired over the canoes, and 5 out of the 6 surrendered, the one he had spoken with getting away. He was now told that the gun had been stolen by a native of Tiaraboo, and therefore Otoo was unable to get it back. So after a little discussion, he decided to put up with the loss, and sent word to the king that he would say no more about it. In the evening, however, the musket and some articles that had not been missed were returned, and the men who brought them were duly rewarded. Cook says it was remarkable how many had been actively engaged in their recovery. One man in particular described most vividly how he had followed up, attacked and killed the thief of the musket, but at the same time everyone was well aware that this hero had never been away from his own house throughout the day. A state call was made to Otu, and with the usual exchange of presents, the old footing was re-established. On the return from this visit, a stop was made at the dockyards, for such they deserved to be called, and the canoes in construction were inspected, 2 of them being the largest the Englishmen had yet seen. The king soon after returned the visit, and requested that the big guns should be fired, but Cook thinks it was very doubtful if the experience was enjoyed. A display of fireworks in the evening was much more to the native taste. Referring to the numerous robberies that had been committed, Cook says he found it far the best to deal mildly with the delinquents, and the regulations he made were, as a rule, well kept by the natives. He was now better pleased with his reception, and concluded that the island was in a more prosperous condition than at his last visit. When the ship was ready to resume her voyage, several young natives volunteered to accompany her, and Mr. Forster was most anxious to take one as a servant, but as Cook could see no prospect of returning them to their homes, he would not permit one to go. Mara deserts. When the anchor was weighed on the 14th of May, Mara, the gunner's mate, whose journal has been quoted, quietly slipped into the water and endeavoured to reach a canoe which was hanging about to pick him up, but he was seen and taken on board again. In his notes he expresses his regret that the scientific world thus lost the chance of having the experiences of a prolonged residence amongst these people placed before it. At the time of leaving there was great talk of the expedition against Eimeo, and Cook would have liked to have watched the proceedings, but he soon saw that nothing would be done whilst he remained in the vicinity. On their arrival at Huihine on the 15th, the ship was immediately boarded by Cook's old friend Oree with the usual present, and he and his friends were invited to dine on board. He was asked what he would like for the return present, and named axes and nails, which were given him, with the request that he should distribute them amongst his people. This he did at once, to the apparent satisfaction of all. The thieving propensities of the natives were still as bad as ever. A shooting party was robbed of its stock of trade goods, and the day after 3 officers were seized and stripped, so Cook took an armed party ashore, captured 2 of the leading chiefs and a large house, and said he should keep them till the things stolen were returned. This had the desired effect, and everything was soon brought back. On the 23rd of May they sailed for Ulietea, and on their arrival the next day were well received, though it was evident provisions were rather scarce. They were informed here that 2 ships had arrived at Huihine, one commanded by Banks and the other by Furneaux, and their informant describes both captains so well that it was some time before Cook ventured to reject the tale as too improbable. It is possible that there was some foundation for the story that ships had been seen, for it afterwards became known that Monsieur St. Denis had been in the South Pacific about this time with 2 vessels. Notwithstanding pressing invitations from the natives to stay, Cook sailed for Lord Howe's Island, discovered by Wallis, reaching it on the 6th of June. but as it seemed uninhabited, it offered no inducement for any stay. On the 16th, a chain of sandbanks and islets surrounding a lagoon, into which no practicable entrance could be seen, was named Palmerston's Islands, and on the 20th a landing was effected on Savage Island, but as the natives were very threatening, and the country enabled them to approach closely without exposing themselves, the party retired to the boats. A few spears were thrown, and Mara says that one would have struck Cook had he not seen it coming and stooped in time to avoid it, and then aimed with his gun loaded with small shot at the thrower, but it missed fire. A short time afterwards he again tried it, aiming in the air, and it was discharged. Forster attributes the constant misfires to the bad quality of the flints supplied by the government, and says that English flints had a very unsatisfactory reputation on the continent. More thieving. The course was now set for Rotterdam, where they arrived on the 26th of June, and were fairly well received by the natives, who brought supplies of fruit before the anchorage had been reached. But they soon began to play the old game of trying to annex anything that took their fancy. One seized the lead which was in use, whilst a second tried to cut the line with a stone, and was only persuaded to desist by a charge of small shot fired at his legs. A small party of sailors went ashore for water, and a quantity was obtained, but again the natives became too pressing in their attentions. The doctor's musket was stolen, then Mr. Clerk's, then some other things and a cooper's adze, and Cook, though at first inclined to take no notice, felt compelled to seize 2 canoes, and himself wounded a man who had rendered himself conspicuous by his disorderly conduct with a charge of small shot, and it was at first rumoured he was killed. This Cook would not believe, as he had been very careful not to fire at a vital spot. After a time the muskets and some of the other things were given up, so the canoes were returned to their owners, and the adze was demanded. Instead of the adze, however, the reported corpse was brought on board, and proved, on examination by the doctor, to be very little the worse for his experience, having a slight wound on the thigh and a second one on the wrist. He was soon on his feet, and the adze was then produced. The next day the people were very civil, and the crew were able to water without interruption. On the 16th of July they sighted Aurora Island, discovered by Bougainville, but it came on to blow hard, so they did not attempt to anchor. The natives came down fully armed as if to oppose a landing, and the ship passed on to Whitsunday Island. Off Malakolo, good anchorage was found, and the natives came on board, and were so pleased with their reception they returned the next day in greater numbers, and whilst Cook was in his cabin with some who appeared to be chiefs, a great noise arose on deck. A boatkeeper had declined to allow a native to get into his boat, and the islander was fitting an arrow to his bow as Cook came on deck, with the intention of shooting the sailor. Cook shouted at him, and he at once diverted his aim to the captain, but the latter was too quick and peppered him with small shot, spoiling his aim. He was not much hurt, and proceeded to fit another arrow to his bow, when Cook gave him the second barrel and induced him to retire. Some of the others also discharged a few arrows, so a musket was fired over them without any effect. A 4-pound gun was tried, and the effect was truly marvellous. The natives in the rigging and on deck threw themselves into the water, whilst those in the cabin jumped from the ports, and the ship was left in peace. Cook was not favourably impressed by these islanders, and describes them as, in general, the most ugly, ill-proportioned people I ever saw. Forster, however, thought they were very intelligent. They were judged to be a different race from the Society or Friendly Islanders, and spoke a different language. Poisonous fish. After leaving, many of those on board were very ill for a week or 10 days, from having eaten of a fish which Forster calls a Red Sea bream, and Cook believed to be the same as those which poisoned de Quiros's people, and in his account says, "The fish had eaten of poisonous plants, all parts of the flesh became empoisoned. The ship appeared like the hospital of a city which had the plague. There was none who could stand on their feet." Owing to the care of the surgeons, however, all were recovered. The next land seen was a small group of islands named Shepherd's Islands, in honour of my worthy friend, the Plumian Professor of Astronomy at Cambridge. And Mr. Forster complains that Cook's rashness and reliance on good fortune became the principal roads to fame, by being crowned with great and undeserved success. This was very out of place at the time, for Cook was exercising the very greatest precautions, as he fully recognised the dangers by which they were surrounded. He always stood off and on during the night, and only proceeded through unknown waters by day. Several of these islets were of a peculiar formation, and one high columnar rock was named the Monument. Forster gives its height at 140 yards, and other accounts are satisfied with feet. Many of the group were inhabited, but no favourable opportunity for landing occurred. On the 1st of August a fire broke out on board, and Forster writes, "Confusion and horror appeared in all our faces at the bare mention of it, and it was some time before proper measures were taken to stop its progress, for in these moments of danger few are able to collect their faculties and act with cool deliberation." After about half a page of this, on fires in general, he observes, "Providentially the fire of this day was very trifling and extinguished in a few moments." Then a few days after, a marine who had fallen overboard was smartly picked up, and being well looked after by his comrades, was soon showing no ill effects of his accident, thus giving Mr. Forster an opportunity to write of it as an example of "the result of an esprit du corps to which sailors at present are utter strangers," an utterly unwarranted sneer. At Erromango on the 4th of August, Cook went in with the boats, and the natives tried to induce him to come on shore, but something roused suspicion after he and one man got into the water, so making signs that he would come back later, he stepped back. The natives then rushed the boats, trying to drag them onto the beach, and succeeded in stealing 2 oars, at the same time wounding several of the boat's crews, amongst them Mr. Gilbert the master, with a shower of stones, spears and arrows. Cook attempted to give one of the chiefs a charge of small shot, but his gun missed fire, and he was obliged very reluctantly to order the marines to fire, with the result that several of the natives were wounded. Under the circumstances, it was not considered worthwhile remaining, so the ship left for Tanna, some 12 leagues to the south. A bright light had been noticed in that direction the night before, which proved to have been caused by a volcanic eruption. A good anchorage was found at Tanna, and the ship warped close in. Several natives coming on board to trade soon developed the usual propensity to carry off anything that took their fancy. On this occasion the anchor boys were the special attraction. Muskets were fired over their head to no purpose, so a 4-pounder was discharged, which for a time had a good result, but soon they were as bad as ever, so 2 or 3 musketoons were fired close to them, and though none were hurt, the crew were able to get their dinner in peace. Hot Springs. An old man, called by Cook Paowang, appeared to be inclined to be friendly, so Cook landed with a strong party to look for water under his guidance, and met with some of the elders, exchanging presents with them. The next day the ship was warped in, and 3 boats went ashore, but the natives were very threatening, and after some futile attempts to put things on a peaceable footing, a signal was given to the ship and several guns were fired, when all the natives ran away except for Paowang, who was suitably rewarded for his confidence. After a time permission was obtained to get wood, water and ballast, and whilst trying to lift a stone out of a pool below high water mark, one of the crew scalded his hand badly. The pool proved to be one of a series of springs running down a spur of the volcano into the sea. Several were tested with the thermometer, and as much as 202 degrees Fahrenheit was attained. Forster found a number of cracks on the ridge from which sulphurous vapour and smoke issued, and one of the crew, who had been suffering severely from rheumatism, received great temporary benefit from bathing in one of the springs. Many good plantations of yams, sugarcane and plantains were seen, but they could purchase very little as their articles of trade were not appreciated. The natives did not understand the use of iron, and did not require cloth, as they went almost entirely naked. Though no direct signs of cannibalism had been found, Cook was convinced that the practice was not unknown. After leaving Tanna, the western coast of the different islands were followed up till de Bougainville's Passage was reached, when the course was set for Espiritu Santo. In passing Malacolo, canoes put off for the ship, but the wind being favourable, Cook would not delay, and gave Forster the opportunity to remark that the main object of the voyage, that is, the obtaining of knowledge of the natural history of the islands, was made subservient to the production of a new track on the chart of the southern hemisphere. Cardinal Moran's Geography. On the 25th of August they entered the bay which Cook believed to be that discovered by de Quiros, and named by him the Bay of St. Philip and St. Iago, in the Tierra Austral del Espiritu Santo, now known as the New Hebrides. In this conclusion Cook has the support of Dalrymple and modern geographers, but Forster, for some reason which is not quite clear, felt compelled to differ. Cardinal Moran, the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney, also believes Cook to have been mistaken, for in his History of the Catholic Church in Australia he places de Quiros's discovery in Port Curtis, Queensland, where he claims that the first Catholic service ever celebrated in Australia was held. He puts aside the fact that the latitude of Port Curtis, 24 degrees south, does not agree with that given by de Quiros, 15 degrees 20 minutes south, by saying that the positions of newly discovered places were in those days often purposely concealed lest other navigators might appropriate to themselves and their respective countries the results of the discovery. He quotes details given in de Quiros's petitions to the King of Spain, and says, all these details fit in admirably with Port Curtis on the Queensland coast. Now de Quiros says the country he discovered was thickly inhabited by a people who were armed with bows and arrows, possessed vessels of earthenware, lived in houses of wood, roofed with palm leaves, were amply supplied with oranges, limes, pears, almonds larger than those of Spain, hogs, fowls, goats, capons, etc. That in the bay where he anchored there was no sandy barren ground, no mangroves, no ants, no mosquitoes, and that his anchorage lay between two considerable rivers. How these details fit in with Port Curtis may be evident to his eminence, but is not apparent to less distinguished mortals. The district of Port Curtis, when discovered, was thinly populated, and shows no signs of ever having been otherwise. Bows and arrows and earthenware vessels were absolutely unknown throughout Australia. Houses did not exist, except in the form of temporary shelters of branches, leaves and bark. The fruits and animals mentioned were unknown, and sandy barren country with mangroves, ants and mosquitoes does exist in considerable quantity. The anchorage, had de Quiros ever been there, might have been between two rivers, the Boyne and Calliope, both of small size, but Cardinal Moran, to make this detail fit in admirably, has recourse to the bold measure of moving the mouth of the Burnett River from Wide Bay to Port Curtis, some 2½ degrees to the north of its real position. On the other hand, Cook's description of the New Hebrides fits in with much greater accuracy. The latitude was found to be 15 degrees 5 minutes south, and Mr. Cooper, who went ashore with the boats, reported that he landed near a fine stream of fresh water, probably one of those mentioned by de Quiros, and if we were not deceived, we saw the other. The country was described by Cook thus: an uncommonly luxuriant vegetation was everywhere to be seen. The sides of the hills were chequered with plantations, and every valley watered by a stream. Of all the productions of nature this country was adorned with, the coconut trees were the most conspicuous. A few canoes ventured near enough to have some presents thrown to them, but here the intercourse ended. For Cook felt that, notwithstanding the inviting appearance of the place, he had no time to spare from the great object of the expedition, namely the exploration of the Southern Ocean, and as the wind was favourable, sailed for New Zealand for a refit. End of chapter 13, part 2.